Today I'm going to take you on a journey through war poetry, and we're going to have a look at two things: how war has changed, and then also how war poetry has changed. And they both influence each other, like a little bit of a circle, chicken and egg situation. So war poetry has shaped how we view war and our attitudes to war, but also the wars themselves, how they, new weapons and new ways of fighting, how they have shaped poetry that's been generated by war. Your teacher will let you know what your next steps are after watching this video. It might be a quiz on Show My Homework, or it might be something else. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is how war has changed. And there's going to be three time periods. We're going to look at before World War One, during World War One, and after World War One. World War Two was again another sort of, obviously quite similar to World War One, but World War One is seen as this massive turning point in not only how wars are fought, but also how war poetry was written. So let's get started. So before World War One, generally wars were fought very far away, and obviously communication wasn't particularly good. You might get telegrams updating you on what was happening on the front line, but it very much felt like this far away event. And it was generally fought by lower class soldiers. So if you were poor, obviously we're talking sort of Victorian times or before, that would be a really good solid income. If you joined the army, it wouldn't be a great income, but you'd at least have, steady food, shelter, water. So it was quite attractive for lower class people. Other people who might join the army might be middle class, who sort of had, maybe a second or third son, and the first son would inherit all the land or whatever they had, or that would get all the money to go train to be a lawyer or something else. So the second or third son might join the army, but they would generally get a better deal. So the wealthier members, such as those people, those second and third sons, would automatically become generals or commanders. So they'd be higher up, they'd be more protected, they'd have nicer tents to stay in, so they'd be better off. Many would die from disease. Obviously, sanitation was quite poor in those days, so people might not even have made it to the battlefield. They might have, suffered from something else before they actually got to fight in the war. There was a massive reliance on horses and cavalry charges, so it was all about getting on your horse and storming an area and chopping people down, whatever you want to fill in the space of imaginary battle there. But yeah, so it was very much focused on this type of fighting of horses charging, which when we got to World War One was quite impossible, as I'm sure you know, because of the trenches. Generally, there was very much a feeling that, if you died for your country, you were a hero. It was a fantastic way to die. It was, you were a glorious person, and everyone was sort of thought that was fantastic. Not necessarily that we don't feel that way today, but it was much rarer to see people criticizing this idea, or to see people, calling it a waste of a life. And then because the world was the world was not far away, just the war. It was much easier for the government to maintain positive public opinions. So it was much easier to write a positive poem about a war when you're not sat on the front line, and the poets would be far away. You wouldn't get a lower class poet. So the people who are actually fighting right at the front wouldn't have a way of conveying their experiences back home, whereas poets who were generally quite sort of middle or upper class would obviously have would be writing from miles away, and therefore it was much easier to just write about war in a positive way. Women were very absent. You wouldn't join the army if you were a woman. And it was just a case of, for women, the experience was waiting at home to hear of their loved ones. And obviously, because communication was so poor, you'd be waiting a very long time. And one of the poems that you'll study this term deals with that concept, or that idea. Okay, so that's before World War One. During World War One, just everything changed. So obviously now we're much closer to home because we were fighting in France. So the news was slightly harder to control. It wasn't impossible. I'm sure you've heard about censorship and letters being sort of phrases being crossed out or not even sent if it was something that might kind of spoil the war effort by having people be too negative about it. So harder to control, certainly, but not impossible. So because of conscription, so the idea that, it was, if you were healthy and, of adult age, then you had to go and fight. You didn't have choice. You very rarely have reasons why you wouldn't go and fight. So rather than it just being these kind of lower class soldiers and the second and third sons in a society, we now had men from all walks of life, all classes, going over to fight. So obviously the numbers were massive, and the war therefore impacted so many more people than had ever been seen before, which is obviously why it's called World War I. Other than the fact that lots of other countries were involved. This is quite interesting and maybe a lesser known fact, that men were signed up in groups based on where they came from, which was a nice idea in theory, because they'd be fighting alongside their friends or their brothers or, the man from down the street who delivers the milk. But the problem with it was that, if they had a bad day on the battlefield, you could just literally wipe out an entire village's set of men. So they'd be no men left or very few men left. So that was one of the issues with that. And again, one of the poems that we're going to look at will link nicely to that idea. Again, because some things never change, wealthier members of the army would automatically become generals and commanders. But if you just stop and think about what that means, it's not where you get ahead based on merit or based on your understanding of how to fight the war. It's just literally how well known your family is or how rich your family is. So it's not exactly the best setup for this massive army which is required to fight this new enemy with these new weapons. So even though this isn't something that's changed, the damage that this caused was far bigger during World War I. And that is because the fighting experiences were very limited. So you had these generals who'd been in the army for years, but all they knew how to do was charge on horses. They didn't have that experience, that knowledge of how to fight in a trench. So many horses were taken to France and they just became useless. They just couldn't do anything with them. So the generals made a lot of mistakes, and while part of that is because they were in a position they shouldn't have been in the first place, because they didn't really have any qualifications or sort of battle insight. The other thing is the people who actually had experience, it just became useless. This was such a new form of war, trench warfare, that they just had no idea how to handle it properly. The thing, if you want to do more research into that, the best thing to look at is the Battle of the Somme. There were, and this links to one of the poems I'm going to do as well, which is Mametz Wood. Men were asked to walk towards machine guns instead of running, which is crazy. There was barbed wire that hadn't been cut, so the men couldn't move, so they were just sitting ducks. There was a lot of silly mistakes that were made just because it was so unfamiliar to so many of the people who were in charge. We also had new weapons. This is important because we're going to have a look at, one of the poems we have a look at is about a gas attack. So we had gas attacks. Machine guns obviously can kill far more men in a short amount of time than other types of guns. And eventually, I think it was 1917, but don't quote me, we had tanks as well, which were obviously, armoured guns and really hard to destroy. The thing about propaganda with World War I is, and this kind of links back to number one, it was very effective at the start of the war. Everybody, you've probably seen the posters, that idea of go and be a war hero, fight for your country, and it worked really, really well, but it did become decreasingly effective, given that men were dying in the thousands and then the millions. The war lasted much longer than expected. It was supposed to be over by Christmas of the first year, and it lasted 4 years. So it very, very much declined in its impact as the war went on. And it just changed war forever. People were horrified and just so much more exposed to war than they had been in the past. Okay, after World War I. This is the last section we're going to do for how war has changed. Now, obviously, this is like we're talking 100 years here, so it's quite general, and you can probably think of various wars we've had since then. Obviously, we've had World War II, we've had the Vietnam War, we haven't had any more world wars. We've had Afghanistan, we've had Iraq, we've had the Bosnian War. So there's plenty to choose from, unfortunately. And they are obviously slightly different in their own ways, but this is kind of a summary. So the biggest thing to single out World War II for is the planes and the air attacks that came with that war, which were not present in World War One. So if you were in Britain during World War One, you didn't have to worry about your house getting bombed. Whereas now in World War II, a lot of people at home had a direct experience of the war because of the Blitz, and they knew, they were experiencing some of the things, not all the things, but some of the things that the soldiers were feeling and experiencing as well. So again, World War II meant that far more people had a direct experience of the war. I think the other thing, just a little side note about World War II as well, is obviously the Holocaust. And I don't know what you thought if you've done the opinions lesson, whether you think some wars are justified. Whether with World War II there is a sort of, maybe, if we hadn't fought in World War II and the Holocaust continued and Hitler had continued to invade, the impacts of the world are worth considering. So I don't know, it's something to think about with World War II in terms of how justified it was. Right, so you've got to imagine now it's 1945. We've had in sort of one or two generations. Well, we've had World War One, then we had a massive depression where everybody lost a lot of money and there was loads of poverty, and then we had World War Two. So by this point, everybody just wants to have a nice life and stop having to send the boys or the husbands away to die for their country. So there was just a massive desire for peace and a massive desire for society to look after each other. That's when we created the NHS. A really important time period for us about looking after each other. But another thing that massively changed, but this was since World War One, was that people were far more aware of the psychological impacts of war. So things like shell shock. Shell shock was never heard of before World War One. The idea that a soldier could return from war and be in some way mentally damaged by their experiences, experiencing flashbacks, responding extremely to loud noises, that just wasn't even considered to be a problem or an issue before World War One. Now people are far more aware of that, and they were more aware of it going into World War II as well. And other long-term effects, like obviously physical damage, the financial support that's required if soldiers are unable to work, and the emotional support as well, I should have put there. So that was far more of a sort of focus, looking after soldiers. And again, that was prompted by the fact that so many people are affected now compared to the past. There's also more focus placed on women. Obviously, as equality has increased, thank God, we have had, more focus on women with regards to this as well. So either in the way that they're supporting to returning soldiers, they're even actually going to fight. So there's women on the front line in Iraq and Afghanistan, or taking on more responsibility at home. Obviously, during World War II, that was a massive, massive thing. And this is where the relationship between war and society is clear, because in some ways the war prompted the equal rights movement, because it gave women an opportunity to show that they can work and that they can, they can hold that responsibility. Obviously, now since World War One, there's a massive focus on remembering the fallen, and we do remember our fallen heroes every year. And there's still an impact felt in local villages and towns. I'm sure you've got examples in Liverpool, but in Widnes, where I'm from, in Victoria Park, which is our brilliant park that we have here, it's like a tenth of the size of Sefton Park, but it does have a lake, and maybe it's more of a pond. Anyway, they have a list of all of the fallen soldiers from World War One from our town. There's still a parade on Remembrance Sunday, so it's still very much part of our social conscience. Like, we're still very aware of these fallen heroes, and it's very important to us as a society to celebrate that and remember them. So even though our attitudes to war might have shifted, and we'll see in a minute become a bit more negative, actually we're still very we're still very proud, and we still celebrate that. So it's not a case that old style of like celebrating dying for your country has completely gone. It definitely hasn't. I think we're just a bit more realistic about it now. So how are we more realistic about it? We are far more aware now of corrupt motives. So for example, when Britain and America declared war on Iraq, you guys wouldn't have even been born. That was, people were very aware even from day one. Are you invading this country because they have oil? And people are far more aware now that this might not be a perfect motive, and it might not be dying for a glorious way for a glorious reason. We're also much more aware of the impact of war on the environment. And you'll see that in one of the poems that you study. And anti-war protests in the last 30 years have been far more common. People taking to the streets. I remember the war in Iraq. We had wristbands. There were like white wristbands that you could wear to show that you wanted peace and not war. There was a massive march in London, people protesting it, and the same in America as well. Obviously now communication with war zones is much easier. So during the Syrian strikes, I can't remember what year that started, sorry, but there was this, there's an amazing documentary about it, and this frontline doctor is literally at the bottom of this makeshift hospital. There's bombs falling all around him, and he's able to do a live interview with the news channel that was sort of broadcast across the world. Like, that's quite amazing in terms of the ability now to communicate directly with people who are in war zones. And if you compare that to World War One or before World War One, where you were relying on telegrams or censored letters or poems that might be published 2 years later, this is amazing sort of opportunity now. Is that the right phrase? I don't know. It's a better way of finding out what's going on the ground, and I think it's a really important way of communicating to the public what's going on, so that they can protest it if they need to or want to, and so that the people who are experiencing these things can actually get their voices heard. I remember when I was at university, when Lebanon was getting bombed, and the social media had just started, and I remember I was working in newsagents, and it was on the radio, like someone who'd been communicating via Facebook about what was happening outside their window. It was so powerful. So that's something to think about for modern wars, and also moving forward. Hopefully we won't have any more wars. But that does almost make it easier, I suppose, for people's voices to be heard. Okay, so that's sort of how war has changed over a span of 200 years, and obviously that has had an impact on war poetry. But before we move on to that in too much detail, I just want to kind of ask this question: what is war poetry? It is a genre in its own right. Excuse me. So just like fantasy fiction or sci-fi or romance, war poetry has become its own defined form, and it's very, very celebrated. To me, it's like an historical document. It is especially World War One poetry, which is mostly what we associate with war poetry when we think of it as a genre. It's mostly the World War One poets that we envision, because it was just. I remember the first time I read any World War One poetry, and it feels like you are reading a diary. It feels like you're reading a first-hand account of this horrific thing that you just can't imagine. And linked to that, I actually think war films are one of the few genres where I would say sometimes it's more powerful to watch the film than read the book, shock horror, because I remember reading Atonement, which is about war amongst other things. And when I watched the film, I did find the film more powerful because I couldn't imagine these things, these words I was reading, because I couldn't imagine anything that horrific. And sometimes I think you need somebody to actually show it to you. So war films, I think, are very, very powerful, and just such. And that's also why the poetry matters, because it's a way of giving us insight into something that, unless you've been there, how can you possibly imagine it? Okay, enough waffling from me. Right, so how war poetry has changed. So before World War One, I'll come to that quote in a minute. Almost the opposite of the army with the lower class soldiers, and I did mention this, poets were generally middle or upper class men who had never seen a war zone. So how could they write realistically? You know, how could they do the things that I've just talked about, that I'm really passionate about what war poetry can do? They couldn't. So their poems generally celebrated soldiers as heroes, they glorified their deaths. Now, this isn't all negative. If you're a wife or a mother at home and your son or husband is fighting in this war hundreds of miles away and you have no idea what's happening, and a poet publishes a poem in the newspaper and you read it, you would rather read a positive poem celebrating their deaths than, you know, an horrific account. So there's pros and cons to this, but you know, don't just see it as a real negative. And also the soldiers themselves, you know, they would want to be celebrated and they would want to be hailed as heroes. I am assuming what they want there. As expected then, the focus was very much on, you know, the brilliance of cavalry charges and men following orders bravely. And that links directly to the quote above from Tennyson. So this is from the Charger Light Brigade. It's probably my favourite pre-1914 war poem. And basically in it, there's sort of a group of men, 600 men, who charge this valley, and there's cannons basically waiting for them, and they just get decimated. It's a horrible experience, and I think it's about 200 men who survived the charge. And there's this really sad, most of the poem is really celebratory. You know, they're heroic, they're charging into the mouth of death. But there's this really telling two lines, as you can see: ours not to reason why, ours but to do and die. Because one of the foot soldiers, these lower class men who would just do what they were told, had realised that this was going to be a mistake, that this was going to, you know, lead to a lot of deaths, that they were hitting, this wasn't a good idea. But it was not theirs to ask questions. It was not their job to ask why. It was their job to do and die. So there's this idea in the poem that their role is to just do it, but it's presented to us as, that's so brave. Like, that is so brave to charge into that valley, knowing that you know that you were charging into this really dangerous situation, and for you not to question orders because that's your duty. So I just think that gives you a really good flavour of the typical type of poem that you might have got before World War One. Now, you won't be studying a typical poem from this time period, which is why I've included the Tennyson quote as an idea. However, you will study a poem from this time period, which is A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy. We'll come to this in a few lessons' time. If you follow the lessons, we're going to look at context more specifically. But what you'll see is that Hardy kind of subverts. That means he sort of goes against this. He doesn't celebrate the soldiers as heroes, and he doesn't glorify their deaths. And he does write quite a realistic poem about war. So I think it's important for you to see that you know, the Tennyson quote there is a typical poem, you know, lines from this time period. So when you do eventually read Hardy, you hopefully will be able to see that he's not reflecting this idea at all. So go Hardy for going against the grain of his time. Whoop. Okay, so during World War One, war poetry massively changed because obviously war massively changed, and that's why the World War One poets are heralded as this fantastic, glorious beacon in the war poetry genre. So it changed everything. So at the start, it didn't change. So just to contradict myself, at the start, it was very much still reflecting the spirit that I've just explained. So it was very much still dying for your country is amazing. The poems were almost a form of propaganda. Let's go and fight for England. You will read a poem that completely reflects this perfectly. It's called The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. So that'll be coming your way. But very much, he wrote it in 1914 as well. So right at the start of the war, you could argue that the poems of that time period, that specific, first 6 months, first year, were still quite naive and weren't really aware of the horrors they were going into, because they were just basing their experience of war from past poems and past news reports and past wars, which were completely different, and they were still very much feeling positive and upbeat about and patriotic, which obviously the country, again, don't forget the plus side, that the country does need that. They're going to war whether they want to or not. So there are pros to this kind of poetry and shaping people's mindsets in this way. Then, of course, they went and landed in France and experienced something they had no idea or what to expect. And like I've said at the top, everything just changed. So for the first time, you did not have these middle and upper class poets miles away. These poets were on the battlefield. They were right there in the trenches, seeing all the horrors firsthand. So that obviously changed war poetry completely. The war also made poets of men. If you sat in a trench, you've got a pencil and a piece of paper. Poetry is a really good way to express our feelings. And I think that's just something that's good to remember for life. It's a nice short, poems don't have to be short, but sometimes it's the feeling of crafting your feelings onto a page in a form of a poem can really help you work through things or help you to think about what you're focused on. So highly recommended, not just for men in battle zones. So yeah. Obviously, the new weapons that we've already talked about, the gas, the machine guns, etc., meant that the horrors of this war were worse than any that had been experienced before, which meant the poems that were being generated were far more horrific than anything we'd seen before World War I. So war poetry as a whole, especially as you move towards 1916, 17, 18, became very political and exposing. It became realistic. And like I said, it became like an historical document, an insight into what really went on, despite all the propaganda machine trying to make you think that everything was going perfectly. So you're going to study Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, which completely reflects that point number 6. It is political, it's exposing what's happening, and it's very realistic. If you want to do any further research on the war poets, there's so many poems by Wilfred Owen that are amazing. The Chances is really good, Exposure is really good, and also Sassoon is another really celebrated poet. It'd be really good to read some of his as well. A lot of them are really accessible. So if you want to read more about the World War I poets, definitely explore those. It's a shame that you only get to study Dulce, sad face. Okay, so after World War I, and again, we're talking 100 years here, so we're being quite general, but I've just kind of summarised it as best that I can. So, as I've already been saying about 50,000 times, it's very much now that war poetry is established as a type of historical document. It's expected to be honest. It's expected to be realistic. It's not that we no longer celebrate fallen soldiers, but it's just that it would seem naive now to do an account of war through a poem that was the same kind of idealistic notions that we had before World War I, where everything was presented as this glorious perfection, brilliant way to die. So, something we need to think about in terms of our war poems is that since World War II, conscription hasn't happened. So if you are a poet writing a war poem sort of after World War II, the chances are you've not fought in the war or any war. You've not got direct experience of the battlefield. And you're going to study two poets who reflect that idea. So The Manhunt by Simon Armitage and Mammoth's Wood by Owen Shears, neither of those poets have ever fought in the war. And they kind of overcome that by Simon Armitage doesn't write as himself, he writes as the wife of a fallen soldier. And it is based on a real couple. And Owen Shears writes more about the long-term impact of World War One on his community, on the battlefields of France and on his community, and almost focuses more on how people are remembered. So I guess what's different here is that we've not got, in your anthology at least, we've not got two poets who are pretending that they get it. They're not pretending that they know what it feels like to charge into a valley of death facing cannons when they know that the mistake has been made, like we discussed with Tennyson. These are two poets who are aware of their limitations and they're exploring war in different ways. So that's important to think that that's a different approach. And obviously I'm just talking about the two poems in the anthology there. I'm not saying that no poet ever since World War II has attempted to do that. So what you'll see in those two poems and just generally in the genre is that because obviously our attitudes to war have changed, like we discussed previously, poetry since World War II has become far more focused on the long-term impacts of war. So psychological and physical damage to the soldier and his family, you'll see that in The Manhunt, and also the impact on communities and the environment and the motives and the politics surrounding wars. So, and you'll see some of that in Mammoth's Wood. So it's very much about the long-term impact, especially the two in your anthology. You in your anthology, Modern War Poems, you don't have any examples of ones that are focused primarily on the actual battle themselves. Okay, this is just some food for thought. Could you argue that war poetry is going to become decreasingly important because is social media going to replace it as our historical document? So is Twitter where war poetry is now created in 140 characters? So, I was saying before about how when I was at university and I was in the shop and I was heard about Lebanon and people were communicating on social media, is that what people are doing now? Is that a form of poetry, a form of insight into what's going on? Just something to think about. Okay, so that ends the video. Please do go back, because I know I do talk quite fast. If you want to revisit anything, obviously pause and make your notes. And then I think it's important that you do kind of have this insight into how war's changed and then also how the genre's changed, because it means that when you come to approach your poems, you're going to be really clear on, oh, I can see why that's been written that way because it's from this time period, or I can see how, this has been shaped by the war, or the poem has shaped how people see war. So this is kind of your foundation. So please do go back. If there's anything you're not sure of, obviously you can ask as well. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's one of the most interesting topics that we do for our poetry anthology, and I hope you're all okay. Take care. Goodbye.